Over my career, I've done a lot of interviews with some well-known people and some people no one's heard about before. I thought it might be fun to drag some of them out of the archives and share them here on YouTube. Sometimes you run into somebody who just strikes you as being very classy. Maurice Engelman is one of those people. I saw him playing in a concert here in Palm Springs, and I said, Maurice, I have to interview you, especially because you knew Cole Porter.
I was born in San Jose, California, and because I had a Jewish mother, I started playing the violin when I was 2. The teacher, I'm told, I don't really remember it, but I'm told that the teacher suggested to my mother that she bring me back when I'm 4 because I had an attention span problem. Between the ages of 2 and 4, my mother absolutely sat with me and made me play the violin every day. And finally at 4, I really started taking serious lessons and continued that. Music has always been part of my life and remains such, even today. My professional career probably began when I was at school at the University of California at Berkeley, and a group was formed called the Straw Hatters. And we worked together, we did sketches and so forth. Of course, I wrote the scores, but we also performed on stage, and we had our own theater in Lafayette, California, during the summer, and finally in San Francisco on Golden Gate Avenue. And I was doing that for 4 or 5 years perhaps, then went to Los Angeles with my then lyricist, and we began writing motion picture scores.
Let's go back to your time at Berkeley. This would have been in what era?
I was born in 1927.
Okay, so you were in college in 37
I was actually in college when I was 14.
Wow.
I was a freshman when I was 14.
What was the artistic and musical life of San Francisco like at that time? It's always been a nurturing kind of city.
It was, and it was very active and motivational. San Francisco was it was really a center of what was happening musically in the country. Of course, this is all before rock and roll and all that sort of thing, which I wasn't. I lost track of music at that point.
Well, I remember Carol Channing, who lived in San Francisco, of course, telling me how every week she went to a different theater as a child.
That's right. I knew her, too.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Yes.
Not well, but I knew her.
I will say this. The interview I did with her about 15 years ago, I still treasure as the funniest interview I ever did. And I have a recording that I made many copies of to save where instead of singing Hello Dolly, she sings Hello Dennis Daly.
Oh,
which just, is a real treasure. But she was saying that she would get on the bus or the cable car or whatever type of transportation it was and go down, and that there were so many theaters in San Francisco back then.
There really were. And it wasn't just theaters. San Francisco had some very sophisticated nightclubs that always highlighted music and bands and that kind of thing. But San Francisco was, and the University of California was, Berkeley was right across the bay, and it too was I would have to say, one of the centers of serious music in the country.
I've always looked at Berkeley as being the one white-collar thing on that side of the bay, because I remember the first time, and I've gone to San Francisco many times, but the first time I went over to Oakland, and I thought, boy, Oakland is about as blue-collar as San Francisco is white-collar. But Berkeley, if you haven't been there, is such a beautiful campus on a hillside, which burned at one time, I understand. And is it the Claremont?
The Claremont Hotel.
Hotel is very near the campus.
And incidentally, the Claremont Hotel was then owned by a friend of mine who lived in Portland, Oregon. His name was Harold Schnitzel, and He happened to own the Claremont Hotel. And as luck would have it, I often played the Claremont.
You know, it has that lovely feel, almost as if I would imagine the Mackinac Island Hotel has all white wood and.
It does. It does. It emanates a kind of romance and architectural beauty and so forth.
My first memory of the Claremont was that I couldn't find a place to park. Probably you could never find a place to park there. Now, when you were there at Berkeley, were you in the music program or just doing that as an aside?
No. My first year, I was pre-med. Then I switched. In my second year, I switched to music and took my degree in music. Studied composition, really. I really kind of forget the year I graduated, but it was in the 1940s somewhere. But the music department it was just a fabulous place to study if you were serious about writing serious music.
Yeah, and I'm lucky having gone to Indiana University several decades later, but the fact that the Indiana University music program, which kind of like Berkeley was an oasis of culture, had people coming from around the world to study and teach and perform. I imagine that Berkeley was even more so at that time.
Well, I don't know about more so, but it was certainly that. And it wasn't just Berkeley. The whole California scene was very special. Bear in mind, this was like shortly after World War World War II. And so many fabulous, serious musicians from Europe escaped, came to this country, and with only one exception that I can think of, and that would be Paul Hindemith, who stayed on the East Coast. But most of them rolled down to California. And people like Stravinsky and Arnold Schoenberg, and we're talking about some of the iconic classical composers of the day. And they were all available to those of us who were in Berkeley. In the summer, I would go to Los Angeles and study for the summer with either Schoenberg or Talk or somebody.
Well, you know, as tragic and indescribably horrible World War II was, if there was any positive effect, it was the emigration of doctors, lawyers, composers, real thinkers who came to the U.S. and incredibly enriched our culture.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it was a benefit a very unexpected benefit.
Well, you talk about Paul Hindemith. A friend of mine is a trumpeter, and he said he loves Paul Hindemith, and many musicians do, because Hindemith was kind of a player's composer. He wrote something for nearly every instrument, so everybody liked him. I mean, there's even I think a piccolo concerto he wrote. But, when he ran out of something to do, he'd say, "Now, what instrument haven't I written a concerto for yet?"
Well, actually, he was the only one I can think of who remained on the East Coast, and I believe he wound up on the Princeton campus. Everybody else came down to California.
And the only one I know of who really went to the Midwest was much earlier was Dvorak, who went to either Kansas or Nebraska.
Oh, that would have been in the 1980s.
Right, that would have been much before that. But
yes. In fact, I think Dvorak, I could be wrong, I have a lingering memory that when in the United States, he did some conducting, such as the New York Philharmonic and so forth. I believe he did. But that was very, very much earlier.
The other thing, too, I being a student of radio, I was doing a story the other day about how, from the very beginning, classical music was such a part of broadcasting. And then David Sarnoff comes along at NBC, looks around the world for the best conductor he could find, and forms the NBC Symphony.
Didn't Toscanini do
Toscanini, yes, brought him over from Italy.
Sure.
And they had, people such as Serge Kouzovitsky back then, and all these people who would nurture the Copeland generation eventually. But there was it was taken for granted on radio that you needed good music. And I don't want to get yet into how much we've changed.
Yeah.
But if you were a classical performer, you had only to turn on the radio at the right time, and it was there.
It was marvelous. It was, and I remember it.
So how long were you in Berkeley?
Let's see, I arrived when I was 14, as I say, and I think I graduated maybe when I was 17 or 18. The war kind of prolonged my
yes.
My school career, but I was in Berkeley, I guess, until about 1947 or 8, something like that, just to place a time on it. I know I was married when I was 21 or 2, at age, 21 or 2, in 1949. So, but I was a musician then. That's what I was doing for a living.
Now, you mentioned meeting your lyricist. I have only really interviewed 2 well-known composers. I got to know Jerry Goldsmith fairly well.
Not too shabby.
Nearly 300 movie scores.
Oh, sure.
And spent some time with Steve Allen.
Well, now, I knew Steve Allen, too.
And I remember, and for those who are too young, he was the original host of The Tonight Show. And when The Tonight Show would lag, he would walk over and play the piano or write a piece of music. But I was impressed at how big his skull was when I met him the first time. It's really a huge cranium.
As a matter of fact, I worked with Steve on ABC in Los Angeles. He was a very solid musician. He really was.
We were talking about the wealth of composers who were in America in the 30s and 40s. And he ran down a litany starting with Rudolf Frimmel and Berlin and Johnny Mercer and Gershwin and all these people who were alive at one time.
Amazing.
And
Really
it must have been 20 or 22 very well-known composers.
Oh, absolutely. In my life, I've had some marvelous, memorable experiences. And you mentioned the name Gershwin. That was one of my it wasn't George, it was Ira. My agent in Los Angeles was MCA, Music Corporation of America.
Which is a huge agency.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one day they called and asked if my then lyricist, whose name was Alan Alch, and I would like to meet Ira Gershwin. Ira was living in Beverly Hills in those days, and apparently he enjoyed encouraging young would-be composers and lyricists. So I said, gee, would I like to meet God? Of course I thought.
Yeah, what do you mean, would I like to meet Ira Gershwin?
Anyway, it was arranged, and it was on a Wednesday, as I recall, and about 1 o'clock, Alan and I came to his home in Beverly Hills. He was every bit as urbane and charming and so forth as one would hope. We entered the house with him and walked down a hall, and there was a kitchen on the way, and he introduced us to his wife on the way, and then we went to the living room. And we started talking, and somehow the conversation turned to romantic songs, love songs of the 20th century. And I was maybe 22 at the time, and I had only been married 3 or 4 months. And I said, well, Mr. Gershwin, you've certainly contributed your fair share of love songs to the 20th century. In fact, my wife's and my song is one of your love songs, Embraceable You. And he smiled wanly, and he said, gee, I hate to disappoint you, but I didn't write Embraceable You as a love song. I said, really? He said, no. My wife, and he pointed at the kitchen, my wife had just given birth to our infant daughter. And I wrote Embraceable You as a lullaby.
Wow.
I said, well, when you think about it, come to Papa, come to Papa,
do, yes.
Well, it was quite a surprise.
I've done a speech every so often called Words Without Music, in which I recite the poetry. And there's a modern-day song, I think it's from the 70s. It was ostensibly a rock song. I'm not talking about moving in, and I don't want to change your life, but there's a warm wind blowing the stars around, and I'd really like to see you tonight. Now, for modern day, that's pretty good poetry.
Oh, yeah.
I almost cried when I read that. I recite the words to Stardust, the man who was almost my uncle, Hoagie Carmichael. And I said, no, that's Mitchell Parrish.
No.
And if you sing it, it's Hoagie Carmichael.
Yes, yes.
But to get back to Steve Allen, the one thing I had mentioned to him and Jerry Goldsmith is I've written maybe 3 songs in my life. Mm-hmm. But the creative process of bringing a melody out of nowhere must surprise the composer sometimes.
It does. It does. I would have to say, there's been an age-old discussion or argument about which is more important, the music or the lyrics. And as a composer, I would have to say the lyrics are more important. It's true, you whistle or hum the melody, but intellectually, those lyrics are sticking in your head, and they more, in my opinion, they control where it's going. And
do they inspire?
Oh, absolutely.
And you're saying then that there are many cases where the lyricist will say, let's put music to this.
Absolutely.
But in the reverse, the Beatles had a song.
Go either way.
Have you ever heard of the song called Scrambled Eggs?
No, I haven't.
McCartney had written a song, a little melody line, and they called it Scrambled Eggs. And it was da-da-dum, scrambled eggs, and it became Yesterday, all
really?
my trouble. But for a year or so, they just called it Scrambled Eggs until one day Lennon said, how about Yesterday? That kind of fits, and the rest is history, as
Yes,
they
it
say.
is. Yes, it is. That's fascinating.
Did you know Ray Evans and Jay Livingston? They
No, I
were
didn't know them.
songwriters
I certainly knew who Jay Livingston was.
They were songwriters for about 50 years, and they got called upon by Hollywood when they needed something overnight.
I know.
So they wrote a lot of lousy stuff, and they wrote a lot of very pretty things.
I know.
And I interviewed them on their 50th anniversary, and you'll get a kick out of that. I decided to bake a cake, so I baked a flat sheet cake, and I put a treble clef on it.
Oh, perfect.
And I put the notes from one of their best-known songs, I Hear the Cottonwoods Whispering Above, from Tammy. Didn't put the lyric, just the notes. So I show up at Livingston's house in Bel Air, and I give the sheet cake to Ray Evans. He puts it up on the grand piano, and I thought, my God, it's going to fall and there'll be cake all over the place. And he turned to me and he said, I've heard of sheet music, but I've never heard of sheet cake music before. And I thought that was pretty inventive. I think those guys went to their grave remembering me as the guys who brought them a cake with Tammy on it. But,
oh, that's lovely.
So when was your first collaboration with your lyricist?
Oh, with Alan? Well, it was in the Straw Hatters.
Oh, okay. Back in Berkeley.
Yes, he was a Straw Hatter. Mm-hmm. And when we left the Straw Hatters, we went to Los Angeles together as a team. And we remained a team for as long as I was there. Mm-hmm. He's no longer living, but he was really a very good lyricist. I did have a very memorable experience at that time. We had written a show called Of All Things.
Good title.
And it was produced in Los Angeles. And the second or third night, not opening night, the second or third night, I had written the score to be performed by double piano because we couldn't afford a
pit orchestra.
That's right,
or a pit band even.
That's right. Be that as it may, I was one of the two pianists, and at the intermission, I was standing in the pit, and of course the audience was going toward the rear of the theater. There was one man, I'm guessing he was in his early 60s, and he was walking with two canes, but he was walking directly toward me, toward the pit. And he said, "Are you Maurice Engelman? You wrote the score of tonight's show?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, I want you to know I'm very much enjoying it. My name is Cole Porter."
My God.
And I thought to myself, yes, and of course I'm Ludwig van Beethoven.
Right.
You know, but it really was.
Well, he was on two canes, and that made sense.
And he really was Porter, of course. And in spite of the disparity in our ages, we became really good friends. In those days, everybody smoked.
Mm-hmm.
So he and I went backstage and had a cigarette together. And we became really very good friends. Now,
I am so envious of you because for two reasons, actually three. I was always told that Cole Porter's father's half-brother was my great-grandfather.
Is that right?
Yes. And my mother's maiden name was Porter, so I don't disbelieve that. And being from Indiana, I love Cole Porter. But was there any American composer who wrote the lyrics to his own songs, and the lyrics themselves were so damned acerbic and outstanding that he could have just been known as a lyricist?
There are only a couple who wrote their own lyrics and music. One was Irving Berlin, of course. Another was Cole Porter. And I can't think of any other of that stature.
And so many of them had to call upon the great lyricist Johnny Mercer to bail them out.
That's absolutely true.
He was really a utility lyricist, Johnny Mercer, and not a bad singer.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Marvelous. But I was going to tell you.
Yes, go ahead with Porter.
In that show were two people one you might know, Peter Marshall.
Oh, yes.
And Tommy Noonan was his partner. 3 years later, I got a phone call from Peter saying that he and Tommy had a gig, a contract with the Clover Club, which was a nightclub in Portland, and where should they stay? And I said, well, you'll stay with my wife and me, which they did. And we went to the club on opening night, and both he and his partner and I, all of us, agreed that the show was a little short, needed one more something or other, and they asked if I would write something. Well, I explained that I really don't write lyrics, but that maybe I could do a parody of one of Cole Porter's things. And I did, and they liked it. But then it occurred to me, hey, they're going to make money on this thing. They're doing it professionally. I should get Mr. Porter's approval. And I still had his phone number in Los Angeles. So I phoned, and he was very charming. And, hello, Maurice, how are you? How have you been? It's been... So then I explained what had happened, and I said, I'm really just calling to get your approval on Peter and Tommy singing a parody of one of your things. He said, well, say it to me, and I did. And it was, I love Portland in the summer when it's raining. I love Portland in the fall when it's raining. I love Portland in the winter when it's raining. I love Portland best of all when it's raining. I love Portland every moment of the year. Why, oh, why do I love Portland? Why, oh, why do I love Portland? I sell umbrellas here.
Oh, fantastic.
Well, Cole Porter laughed, thought it was funny, and approved. And it was Peter and Tommy sang it.
Wow. And I cannot imagine Cole Porter having said, "Don't do that. You stole my song."
No, he wouldn't.
He must have been such a gracious man. And for those who don't know, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story, explain to us what happened to this man whose songs were the driving force of Broadway and then Hollywood for 2 decades. Tragic end.
Well, you know, he had a very serious accident, horseback riding, which is why he was reduced to walking with 2 canes. And I think that put an end to his composition career. I mean, he was very seriously injured. Almost died, I think.
Well, and some of his lyrics, even when he was well, you take the song that he's probably best known for. Matter of fact, the movie was about his life, was called that. Night and Day. The lyric is this person who is taunted by the memory, I think of you night and day. It's such a dark, depressing lyric.
I know.
And you wonder whether the man was that lonely. That because they say so much music is autobiographical.
He might have been.
Yeah.
Might have been. He was a remarkable guy. I mean, I found him so. I was just a kid, and he was...
Yeah, but you must have felt more than in awe when you met this man, when he came up to you and said, "I like your music." Is there any better compliment?
It was
and
marvelous. The
fact you still tell that story today.
I do, and I think of it often, as a matter of fact.
I think of you. Did you ever write something that you liked a lot and a close friend came to you and said, "Maurice, it's got problems"?
Oh, sure, of course.
Not often, I hope.
Not as often as, well, I was pretty lucky, actually, but of course, the thing that distinguishes, let's say, a Beethoven or a Mozart isn't that you write everything so perfectly. The trick is to know what to throw away. And if you have a knack of throwing away the junk, you come out pretty well. But I think that is the key, the ultimate key to success.
You have to swallow your ego, though, to do that.
A little, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
I know as a writer, editing my own stuff is painful.
It's hard. Very
particularly, and I'm sure whether it's a musical or a movie or an article you're writing, when your editor says, it's 400 words too long. And you go back and you say, but it's all perfect.
Which 400 words?
You tell me which 400 words.
Of course.
I used to hate editors, and then those years I worked for United Press International, I realized, a good editor's your best friend.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's like cutting off an arm or a leg.
That's right. Remember the movie Amadeus, about the life of Mozart, a young man named Tom Holtz, and I've never seen since. The one person he's working for says, "There are too many notes. There are just too many notes." And Mozart says, "All right, which one?" Said, "I don't know, but there's too much music here." So tell me more about what you did in Portland. Your career starts
Portland,
to expand.
Well, I remained involved in music, but not professionally. I had a very varied, varied career. Initially, I was in the women's apparel business. My father-in-law owned, I think it was 7 stores in Portland and places like Walla Walla, even all over the place.
Now, that's a good way to get into the business, though. Marry into it.
That's absolutely
yes.
true. And I did. And then after, I was in that business maybe 3 or 4 years, and then somehow slid, fortunately, into the life insurance business. And I mean, it sounds banal and so forth, but it was very good to me.
But I would have not thought that, except you have to be pretty darn smart to do it.
Or lucky.
Or lucky.
Yeah. But it was a very, the business was very kind to me. And I remained in that business for quite some time. Now today, I'm still very involved in music. In that, I'm on the board of the Coachella Valley Symphony Orchestra, and I was president of it. I'm on the board of and play in the Desert Chamber Orchestra. So I'm involved in music.
We were speaking of Paul Hindemith earlier. You mentioned chamber music. You know, I was not really much into chamber music until about 10 years ago.
Really?
And I don't know why. Maybe it's because the sound was too small, what I had heard, compared to symphonic music, because I had gotten heavily into Mahler, which takes a long evening.
Oh, you're talking big stuff.
the big stuff. And then I thought the sun rose and set on Dmitri Shostakovich for a long time. And then I heard a string quartet written by a man who's best known as a movie composer, Miklos Rozsa, who did Ben-Hur, Quo Vadis, all those great movies. And I was lifted up listening to this, the energy in this.
That's right.
And it was heavily, what are the instruments usually in a string quartet?
Well, it's two violins, first and second, viola, and cello.
I think this must have been heavy on cello, because as I'm hearing in my mind the soundtrack from Ben-Hur, there's a lot of big, lush movement underneath in that lower register. But I was just blown away, and I thought, well, you know, maybe there are string quartets out there that don't sound like salon music that I need to discover.
But now, there's a difference between quartet music and a so-called chamber orchestra. Because in a quartet, there are only 4 instruments, obviously. In a chamber orchestra, you have all the instruments from the quartet, but multiplied, 2, 3, 4 times. So you have more volume, if nothing else. And we have a desert chamber orchestra here in the Coachella Valley.
You know, I think it would be a revelation for some people to realize how important the violin is. Because you look at a symphony orchestra, and the larger portion of it is the violin section.
That's absolutely true.
And the classic composer Bernard Herrmann, who did so many striking things, I didn't realize till a couple of years ago that the orchestration for Psycho, you know, with the shower scene that's... There's nothing but strings in that entire movie. It's all done with strings.
Well, in a true symphony orchestra like the New York Philharmonic or San Francisco Symphony, in general, the orchestra may be 100 people, 100 instrumentalists, of which about 40 are violins, maybe 20 first violins, 20 second violins, and so forth. So the strings are very, very important to
and the other thing that amazes me about the quality of symphony-level players is they're all in tune. I think the hallmark of a high school orchestra is that they're not all playing the same note.
That is true.
But the purity, some of the quiet sections, I know it's not usually done with a large orchestra, but I was listening to a recording of Appalachian Spring the other day.
Copeland?
And
Aaron Copeland.
you have to have that unity on those low passages.
Of course.
And I'm thinking, boy, you know, those guys are good. They're not in the Seattle Symphony if they're not good players.
That's right. That's right. Most of the professionals in the major orchestras also teach. And really that's how they amplify their livings and that kind of thing. And yes, they play in tune.
About 15 years ago, I went to Miami to cover a story about a group called the New World Symphony. And this was funded by the fellow who I think had owned one of the cruise lines of the time, probably as a tax write-off. Mm-hmm. But he contacted Michael Tilson Thomas, who's now the musical director of the San Francisco.
That's right.
And said, there are so many kids who get out of college who are concert level, but they've got no place to keep their skills honed. They have to go to work at McDonald's. So they took a select number of them, put them up in a hotel in Miami, gave them a practice hall, booked them into concerts. And I went to one of the rehearsals, and here's a bunch of 21, 22, 23-year-olds wearing T-shirts.
Oh, God.
And they said, what would you like to hear? I said, what are you, a jukebox? I said, okay, the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth. These kids blew me away. But the idea was that you have to stay in practice, to stay at that level. And darned if the phone didn't ring that afternoon, and there was a harpist who got a call from a symphony somewhere. And the young fellow turned to me and he said, you know, she's so lucky because in any given year, how many symphony orchestras need a new harpist? Yeah, aren't that many?
No. As I recall, 3 harpists would be a lot for an orchestra.
Yes, yes.
It's very limited, but it's a gorgeous instrument nonetheless.
Let's shift gears. When did you end up coming west? I mean, permanently.
Well, I never left the West.
That's right. I keep thinking. I think of Portland is the West, but it's not the West I was thinking about. When did you come back to California?
About 25 years ago. I would say about 1988 or something.
And did
like
you
that.
come to the Palm Springs area or
Yes.
somewhere else?
Yes. I had a daughter living here, and it was a reason to come. And so we really came. And then I bought a small hotel while here. I mean, I didn't run it exactly, but
That's another hat for you.
Huh?
That's another hat you're wearing.
That's right.
And a women's apparel, life insurance.
That's right.
And now you own a hotel.
Well, I had quite a bit of property in those days.
Oh, okay.
And this was one of the things, but it was in Palm Springs. It was in Las Palmas, actually.
I should tell people the Las Palmas part of Palm Springs is near downtown, and it is where many of the Hollywood stars live.
That's true.
Matter of fact, they call it the movie colony area.
That's right.
When you came here, it must have been near the end of what a friend of mine called the golden days of Palm Springs, where you would meet Sinatra or Bob Hope at the grocery.
I think that is true.
It's not like that anymore.
No,
not at all. I want to go back to something, though. You said Los Angeles for a while, and something connected with the movie industry?
Well, I used to write motion picture scores when I was first married. That's what I was doing. I was writing motion picture scores.
What is it like to see a movie that has no music, and they say to you, fill it in?
The music is normally the last thing to go into the can, as they say. And you are presented with a script, a time script. And for example, it'll maybe indicate entering with music, and then for 20 seconds there is music. It tells you what the action is on the screen and that kind of thing. So you're really tied to this time script. And it's too mechanical. It's not as creative as you might.
So most directors would dictate to you where and if they wanted music.
Well, the director might not, but the screenwriter would. The director, I don't know. I don't remember the director ever communicating with me one way or another.
But it was someone in the chain of command who just didn't give you carte blanche. You had some instructions.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it becomes, I won't say it's a mechanical procedure, It's not, but it's not as creative as you might think. That's why when you had mentioned Miklos Rozsa, he wrote brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly, when you consider the restrictions that were imposed on him.
And then the other one, of course, who had two brothers who wrote music, and now there are, I think, 6 members of the Newman family still writing music. Alfred Newman, who I understand was the one who kind of developed the modern day system of marking.
Could be.
As you write for
He certainly
for
is
Hollywood.
one of the icons of the business, no question about it.
Did you ever see any of the films you scored, or did you just move on to something else? Yes.
I saw one or two. It wasn't something I wanted particularly to do, but I did. In Portland, my wife and I became very dear friends of Homer Groening and his wife, Margaret Groening. Now, Homer was maybe the best cinematographer in the country. He had been asked dozens of times to please come to Hollywood and work there. He wouldn't do it. He was committed to Portland, Oregon. But we became dear friends, and I had the opportunity of scoring virtually all of his films. And we won several awards because his films really were spectacular.
Were they documentaries, travel logs, industrial kind of films? Because there's an entire industry people don't know about.
I wouldn't say documentaries.
Producing industrial kinds of films.
Well, for example, one of the things we won a number of awards for was a film called Surf, S-U-R-F. And from beginning to end, it was just surfing. And it was so poetically filmed as the surfer cut through the various waves and that kind of thing. It was simply a work of art, and I had the privilege of doing the score. Now, Homer and Margaret had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy. Those children spent a lot of time in my home, and one of them was their son. By the way, I can tell you, I can remember a luncheon that Homer and I had where he was bemoaning the fact that his son was so peculiar. His son wore an earring and I don't know what all, and it bothered Homer.
And now he's one of the wealthiest people in Hollywood.
Of course. And of course it was Matt Groening who went to Hollywood, and Homer on one occasion told me that his son Matt had gone to Los Angeles and wanted to be a cartoonist. He said the kid can't even draw. I mean, he was really worried about him. And of course Matt came up with the Simpsons, and it's been a fabulous career for him. And in The Simpsons, Homer is the father, Maggie is the mother, and his sisters play a role.
Maurice, we've talked about you playing the violin, but you also play piano, which we have right here. Let me do this. Let's do something they used to do on The Tonight Show. I'll noodle a few notes.
All right.
And you make something out of it.
All right.
Okay. Let's go... C, what is it, A flat? I'm doing this upside down?
Yes, you are.
you know, I'm sorry I don't have a Baby Grand. This is a $99 keyboard. He sounds like a $99 keyboard.
No, it works. It works.
I thought you were going to do tone clusters like Fats Waller. Maurice, I want to tell you how much I've loved having you here today.
Oh, that's
and
kind.
it's so nice to talk to someone who has music in his soul and shares it with other people.
Thank you, thank you.
Thanks for being here.
My greatest pleasure. It really is.
Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for going back into the archives with me. I'm Dennis Daly. See you next time, right here on YouTube.